Forbes Books presents Sustainable Leadership and Disruptive Growth with David Radlow. Transformation for a new and better world. Here's David.
My guest this week is Bill Fay, the former CEO of Legendary Pictures and current CEO of Steric Systems. During his illustrious film career, Bill's been involved in making blockbuster movies like The Patriot, Independence Day, 300, and the Hangover series. He has a tremendous track record and reputation for producing consistent winners and great successes. Now he's on a mission to disrupt the spirits industry with PureSmooth, a patent-pending electronic filtration-type process for making spirits smoother and more flavorful, and has garnered local as well as worldwide interest with his service that turns alcohol-based products better tasting quickly. Bill, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here.
Let's go way back. You studied film at Stanford and UCLA. Was filmmaking something you always wanted to do?
No, not really. I actually headed to Stanford. I was interested in becoming a lawyer and getting into politics. While I was at Stanford, ended up taking film courses, and I think I took almost every film course I could find there, and some acting courses and everything, and got very excited about the film business. My mom had actually been in the film business a bit. She worked as an actress up in Seattle, which is where I'm from. So she did some acting and did a lot of modeling and stuff like that. So I was around it a bit when I was a kid, but really didn't have a lot of interest in it. But at Stanford really kind of developed that interest. And then rather than heading off to business school or law school, I packed up and went to UCLA Film School.
Your first entrepreneurial effort was making a movie. It was called Bombs Away. And I understand you funded it thanks to dentists and doctors in Seattle. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
After I got out of UCLA, I was working in the film business down here, really taking every job I could get my hands on. And that was, I think I've almost worked on in every department that works on a movie. But I had also done some production management work down here. And I think I was probably, 25 or so. And a friend of mine in Seattle had written a movie, and it was called Bombs Away, which is a very auspicious title for a film. and he offered to have me produce it. So basically, I produced it. He directed it. We raised the money from whoever we could wrangle in Seattle that had a movie bug of some kind. And I think we ended up putting together about $550,000. And so we shot the movie in Seattle. It ended up doing pretty well, well enough to allow me to do another film back in LA, and that's kind of how I got started.
Okay, that was sort of the gateway into the film industry. What was it like during those early days?
It was quite challenging. I mean, strangely enough, I think part of the reason I got in the film business is that it looked like it would be really hard, and I figured if I could make it there, I could make it anywhere. So I kind of jumped into it, but the first few years were kind of brutal. I mean, I felt like I was kind of taking any job I could get my hands on just to be on film sets, and it was really tough to get traction. And I think if I was approaching it again, I'd probably start in a little bit different way. But I kind of started on working on film sets, and in those early days, never really kind of found the mentor, I think, that would have been helpful for me. That kind of came after I did the film in Seattle, and that really opened up some other doors for me. But it was just really a grind, kind of fighting through one picture to another and trying to get attention and trying to kind of move up the ladder a little bit. You know, a lot of that time you're unemployed. You work on a film for a couple of months, and then you're scrambling to try and find your next job. That's kind of the way it starts. If I was doing it again, I probably would have focused more on getting jobs as an assistant to a producer, or assistant to a writer or director, something that kind of gave a little bit more stability. I did get that opportunity, but fairly early in my career, but unfortunately that company kind of went bankrupt. So it didn't do me all that much good. But once I was able to kind of do the movie, put the first picture together, then that really kind of started to open up some other doors. And I had at least one producing credit. So if you've got one credit, at least people know that you can do the job.
Tell me about how going from a film producer to starting Legendary Pictures, how did that happen?
Well, just to kind of recap some of the spaces in between there, I ended up working as a producer on independent films, and then eventually started producing films for the studios, and was lucky enough to connect with Roland Emmerich, the director. The first picture that we did together was Independence Day, so that really got me a lot of credibility and a lot of opportunity. And I became president of his company, and we worked together for about 7 years. While I was there, not only was I president of the company, but I was also CEO of an effects company that we started, and we also started a couple of digital ventures. This is fairly early on in the internet. So I had a little bit of background in business as CEO of the effects company, aside from movies. So I'd gotten a little bit of exposure to raising money for something besides a movie, and kind of getting a little bit of a big business background there. And that was helpful when Legendary came along. Legendary really was started with a friend of mine named Thomas Tull, a longtime friend. We'd gotten to know each other when I was at Centropolis. And he really kind of had the idea for going out and putting together a company that would be funded by private equity, which really hadn't been done much up to that point. Initially, we had planned to put together some money and actually buy the Orion Film Library from MGM. But when that fell through, because MGM sold all those rights to Sony, we were thinking about what our next steps were. And Thomas basically said, why don't we just start our own film company and put the money together, make a deal with a studio? So that's kind of how that started. I mean, I was lucky enough to be in the right place and team up with Thomas, and then really spent a lot of time laying the groundwork for the company. I think we did more research probably than any other independent company's ever done before going to market. And what we really focused on was we teamed up with, or hired actually, a company based in LA called the Salter Group that really specialized in film data. And they had the data historical data from almost every studio of all the movies that studio had made, and how much money those films had made, and in what mediums those films had made the money. And so all the way through kind of a cash flow situation. And that data it's obviously the studios guard that very, very privately. So we didn't have the data to individual films, but we had the data to really do some Monte Carlo modeling and essentially I think we ran it 3,500 times. What happens if you take a random 25 pictures over 5 years and see how the numbers come out? And a couple of things stood out to us from this historical analysis, and that was genre movies tended to do better than films as a whole, financially. And by genre movies, I'm talking about sci-fi, thrillers, horror, action movies, those kind of genres. And what we kind of called the film geek movies, and we are film geeks as well, the kind of films that people want to line up for 5 hours before opening night. Those films tend to do better than dramas and other genres. So the other thing that we found is that, which seems obvious, but the certain directors tend to be much more successful on average than other directors. So we focused the company on those kind of high-performing directors, and we focused the company on these kind of genres. And what made it really work for private equity was that we could show them the data. We could show them this historical analysis that showed that these films did better and these directors did better. So the whole company was really built around that premise. So from there, we started pitching to different studios. I have to say, I think Warner Brothers was always kind of our number one choice because they had solid management, great IP, great access to quality pictures, and we just had a really good rapport with them as well. So we ended up raising a couple $100 million in equity and a few $100 million in debt on top of that, and made a long-term deal with Warner Brothers. And they turned out to be great partners, and we had a pretty amazing run with them for quite a while.
As we focus in and we talk a little bit how you differentiated with data in order to drive Legendary Pictures, would you mind taking us in and envision how you realize great success in that genre with the value proposition of the movies? Is this a knack, an art form, or does this continue along with your process scientific testing theme?
That's a great question, and I would have to say it's probably both. There certainly is a lot of analysis that needs to go into it, and because we'd set up this rubric for ourselves, and we had a very solid process, green light process, where we put each movie that we were considering with Warner Brothers through this analysis before we greenlit it, we really tried to focus on what we considered our sweet spot was. And I mean, for me, it was doubly good because those kind of movies were the kind of movies I'd been making. I mean, Independence Day and Godzilla and The Patriot kind of all fell in this this kind of category. But the bottom line is there's still a lot of gut processes that go on there. I mean, you've still got to have confidence in the director. I mean, you can put a great director, and if he or she is paired with the wrong project, you know, it's going to be a bit of a battle. But we certainly stuck to that kind of rigorous process. And I would say the one or two times where maybe we varied from it a little bit, didn't work out that well. So right off the bat, we started into a number of films with Warner Brothers. And the biggest first hit we had was the movie 300, the Spartan epic. That really made the company. I mean, one of the things that you find through analysis on movie companies is that, you know, if you can have a hit fairly early out of the gate, it's a huge driver to your ROI. And obviously we had Batman Begins. That was the first movie we did. That was right after we made our deal with Warner Brothers. So that was a great boost, but 300 really gave us that real step forward. In general, I think it's kind of a combination of those two things. You really want to be rigorous with your analysis and kind of stick to what got you there in the first place. But it's still an art form. One of my professors at UCLA was Peter Guber, who went on to run Sony Pictures and obviously a hugely successful producer. And his slogan was always, it's show business. It's not show art, it's show business. So you have to have the business part of it together, but it's not just business, it's show business. So you better understand the show also. You really have to put in that extra piece of it and be looking at, is this script a great script? Is this something that people are going to get excited about? Is it something that actors are going to be able to make come to life in a terrific new way? Is the director that's involved going to gift you with those kind of images that are indelible, the kind of images that people see in a trailer and go, wow, I have got to see that movie. So it's a unique business that way.
Well, it's extraordinary from the outset that you were able to pitch and be able to raise that kind of money from private equity, and you had your secret sauce. When you started to operate, once you raised the money, how important is watching your costs as you take a look at managing your people, your processes, and your strategy?
It's a critical piece of it, and it's and that is factored right up front when we do that kind of green light analysis to decide what movie goes forward and what doesn't. There were a number of times where we had a film where we do our market analysis and feel like we could get a certain number of people in to see the movie. The production team seems solid and everything else, but when we pencil it out, there was just no way that we were going to be able to recoup our costs from the production, barring some massive success. And when you talk about costs, it's obviously your production costs on one side. How long is it going to take you to shoot the movie? How big is the appetite? I mean, obviously, if you're making a movie like Independence Day or Pacific Rim, that's going to cost you 10 times as much to make as it is if you're making The Hangover. So you're looking at that piece of it. And you're also looking at what are you spending on the talent? How much are you giving away? And, if you're making a movie and it seems terrific, you've got Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise and Leonardo DiCaprio that all want to be in it, but you've got to give them all a piece of the profits. At some point, that really starts to cut into your ability to make money on the film too. Now, with the right project, you go back to those actors and you say, hey, we're going to put all three of you in a movie, so we need a little bit of help on this, and hopefully they pitch in a bit. But it's all part of that analysis. But it is critical to sort of have a handle on those costs up front, and then really have a production team that manages that properly. I mean, it's one thing to say, well, we think we can make this movie for $50 million. It's another thing to have the people on board that can really execute that. And we were very fortunate. We worked hard to find the right people, but we were very fortunate as well to work with a lot of line producers. That's the producer that's on the set day to day, managing the budget, working with the director to make the plan of how this movie comes together. And we had a lot of line producers that were really terrific and were able to keep track of what was going on so we could kind of manage that part of the production. I mean, I've seen plenty of movies where things go off the rails a bit, and really you're halfway into it and it's raining and you've got to shut down things, and then you move and all these things are happening, and you can lose track of even where you stand on your budget. And if you spend $60 million to make that movie that you thought you were making for $50 million, that's $10 million off your profits. And that might be the $10 million that makes a difference between success and a failure on that particular film. On the other hand, we kind of always likened the movie business a bit to the oil drilling business, in that if you make 10 movies, chances are 7 of them are going to lose money. Hopefully 2 of them make a little money, and then the 10th one makes so much money that it pays for it puts you into profits. It pays for everything else. That's just kind of the way it works. And we were fortunate enough at Legendary to have a much better batting average than that. And I think a lot of that had to do with the model that we set up. But some of it, to be honest, I'm sure was just good fortune too. We had the good fortune to be involved in 300 and the Hangover series and the Dark Knight series and a number of other things that really, really worked for us. Again, coming back to that focus too, that on directors, we were smart enough to team up with, I think it was probably 6 or 7 key directors directed 2/3 of the projects at Legendary, and they were very, very successful. People like Christopher Nolan, Zack Snyder, Todd Phillips. Those people really made it happen for that company.
Okay, when you're running a film company in a studio, it's really running a bunch of, say, 2 or 3 year production of films. And as an outsider looks at it, similar to the oil business as you mentioned, and they try to grasp their arms around this, they really need to roll up studio revenue, cost, cash flow, never mind assets and liabilities from the separate 2 or 3 year productions that you're running. Is that a fair analysis?
Yes, and I think it's critical when you're running a film company to be aware of how studios work and how their revenue model works, and also understand what kind of expenses and overhead they've got. Our deal with Warner Brothers, because we were bringing in so much cash, really was kind of a revenue split. So this worked really well for us for 2 reasons. First of all, it really moved us upstream as a production company. And when you hear about so-called Hollywood accounting, these stories about producers that make movies and the movie made $150 million and the studio's still telling them that, they're underwater on it, it really helps to be farther upstream the way we were. And you have to have an understanding that you're making movies for a studio. I mean, when we were working with Warner Brothers, we were, a pretty high percentage of their output every year. So we have to pay for a pretty high percentage of the huge overhead that they have to run that company. Hundreds of people working in marketing, distribution, publicity, post-production, ancillary sales, all that kind of stuff. So that's an incredible amount of cash that has to cover that. So the deal that we had was, a certain percentage up front goes to the studio to pay for all that stuff, and then we kind of divide up the revenue after that. So I think it is important to understand sort of the studio perspective on that. As far as the 2 to 3 year productions, that's about how far ahead you're thinking most of the time, because your bigger films are going to take typically 2 years to produce. And that's 2 years after you've got a script that you're really happy with and a director you're happy with, and you're putting everything in motion. You're really kind of forecasting pretty far out in terms of what your cash flow is and, how you handle all that. The great thing about it is as you make these films, you're building a library. So not only are you getting value from the theatrical release and all the ancillary releases of that picture, but after a few years, there's a second cycle for that film where those rights are now available again, and you're reselling that same property. So when you start to build a library the way that Legendary was able to build a film library, you've built a huge ongoing asset with a lot of value. I mean, almost in perpetuity.
So when you take a look at this and you project out, you're taking a look from what you mentioned, Bill, you're taking a look at the script, the projection of the cost of making it, releasing it, perhaps testing it out, and whether or not it's a success or not a success, and then taking it to national and international distribution. Is that fair of the revenue chain there? And then you said really on distribution, it can go out for perpetuity?
Yes. I mean, but the challenge really is that model is changing constantly. Another thing that, frankly, we were fortunate with at Legendary was that the DVD market was very strong at the time we formed the company. So the typical release schedule was theatrical, which was a critical part of our business, of course. I mean, the movies we were making were meant to be something that people had to get up off the couch and go to the theater to see. A critical element, right? So we would have a theatrical release and then kind of premium television, and then the DVD market was just huge in those days. So we could really have a film that didn't really recoup at the box office, but we would have a huge success in the DVD market. And then it would move to television and all sorts of other ancillary markets. Well, I mean, technology is changing so rapidly. Obviously, the DVD business is now dead. So you really are so reliant now on that theatrical business to propel your movie that it really has to work at that level. And then really it's obviously the big markets now are theatrical and streaming. Streaming doesn't pay nearly what the DVD market was. And that's why you're seeing a lot of this sort of bifurcation of movies where if you were making Star Wars or you're making a Marvel movie or you're making Godzilla versus Kong, you've got a big theatrical movie that will get people into the theater. It'll get people off their sofas, right? Because they want to see that on a big screen. If you have a smaller movie, it's really tough to get people into the theater because they know it's going to pop up on streaming soon enough. And obviously, we keep squeezing that window to, it used to be 3 months pretty much before you would see a theatrical release. You would have any other way to get it, really. Now it's, Warner Brothers just this last year, because of COVID, did them day and date where pretty much you could see the movie the day that it opened. And that really is, that's really tough on the theatrical market.
How about foreign films? What decisions are made relative to tax considerations and positive benefits of producing and distributing overseas? And what makes it desirable or undesirable in these international markets?
Well, it's really interesting. Obviously, there's the production side of it and there's the distribution side of it. On the production side, it's a constant change in terms of what benefits you get for going to different countries. When we do that first analysis, that budget analysis, we will typically, if it's a movie that should be shot overseas, and sometimes even if it isn't, we will put it through a lot of analysis, kind of comparing different countries and what it's going to cost to shoot there. And obviously, if we decide, well, one choice is Paris and the other choice is Montreal, well, Paris is going to be a lot more expensive than Montreal. But the other thing that we have to factor in there is that each of these countries has tax benefits and production benefits and incentive programs to get you to come to shoot there. Canada, for example, has an incredibly robust and powerful tax incentive and production incentive program. That's really a motivator as a producer to bring a film there. We ended up shooting 300 in Montreal because the tax benefits we got between the production, and then they had a special tax benefit for visual effects films where they would give you an extra benefit for every shot in your movie that was a visual effects shot. Well, if you remember 300, every shot in the movie is a visual effects shot. There's almost not one that isn't. So we got a huge 20%, 25% of our budget benefit for shooting in Montreal. And that's why we shot a bunch of guys running around in leather Speedos, half naked, in Montreal in the middle of winter when it was 5 degrees below zero outside. You really have to kind of factor in those tax considerations and those rebates that you get from these various countries and make a comparison, and that factors into what your cost will be. Obviously, at the same time, you've got to keep in mind that, you're making an artistic endeavor, and just because you get great tax benefits someplace doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for the movie. You're not going to shoot your Parisian movie in Ohio someplace. You might shoot the interiors there, but you're not going to shoot the rest of the movie there. Then kind of flipping to the release side of it, the international market is constantly changing. There are some countries that are tend to be the major sales countries that we work with, but really depending on sort of the zeitgeist in each country, the value of any particular film can change rapidly. It might be that in France for a few years, dramas and comedies are incredibly successful, and then that kind of dries up and suddenly there's more interest in, genre pictures. We tend to find that a lot of the Asian countries particularly really love genre movies, and those were always big audiences for us. But that market is changing all the time. I mean, even now I'll hear somebody coming to me saying, if you can make X kind of movie, it's going to be huge in territory X, Spain or Italy or someplace, because that's what everybody's dying to see right now. It's a fluctuating market. But it's certainly, the other thing I would say, by the way, for us at Legendary was our focus was one of the things that we were looking at in that historical analysis was the fact that the foreign market was really growing way more rapidly than the US market. And that was kind of hit home to me a few years before we were putting Legendary together with Independence Day, which was one of the first movies to make more money overseas than it did in the United States. I mean, we ended up making, I think, $820 million on the release of that film, and probably, I think about $500 million of it was the overseas market. We really identified that trend in Legendary, and we really tried to focus, again, on movies, those kind of genre movies that would work worldwide. We were probably one of the earlier companies to really focus on that, but with the growth of those markets, now everybody is focused on that. You wouldn't think of making a movie without thinking of what the international sales possibilities were.
China and Russia and other countries with political issues, as they improve their standard of living, these markets still must be exploding. And the question is, how do you tap into them, or how do you analyze their opportunity?
Yeah, well, China in particular, obviously, really over about the last 10 or 12 years has just been exploding as a market, as you said. I mean, they've been building theaters as their standard of living improves and they get a bigger middle class. That middle class wants to be entertained. Yeah, that's been a huge market. But certainly there are some issues working there. Part of the state that actually oversees the movies that are going to be released in China, and they will take a look at your movie and they'll do an analysis of things that they see that they don't necessarily want in that movie, and they'll let you know it. And that may affect your ability to be distributed there. And they have a certain quota of how many films, because they're trying to build the Chinese domestic film market, they only allow a certain number of foreign films to come in there. So that is something that you have to take into account. Secondly, you'll certainly see a lot of movies, especially bigger movies, where there's a Chinese element or a Chinese actor or two incorporated into the film to appeal directly to that market. So they're when they go to the movies, they'll see somebody who's, a Chinese star playing a major role in the film. It's a market that you can't ignore. It's just been huge, and really huge for a number of the films that we did at Legendary. On the other hand, we did The Hangover, which was a huge hit everywhere in the world. And every person I talked to, every Chinese friend of mine that I've ever talked to has seen The Hangover 3 or 4 times. They love it. All their friends in China have seen it. And we didn't make a dime off of it because we could not get past the state approval for release in China. So basically it was pirated and came out on DVD and everywhere else, and everybody's seen it, and we didn't make a dime off of it.
Interesting. Can you comment on newer methods as we segue back to TV and Netflix and Amazon, how that affecting the market?
Yes, it's we're in a period of incredible change in the business because of what's going on in streaming and how people are now consuming their entertainment. And it's having an effect in a number of ways. First of all, just generalizing about the market, this is the golden age of television. I think there's never been so many quality, amazing shows aimed at every demographic and really well done material. It really is the golden age of television. I mean, I can't even keep up with all the series that friends of mine recommend that I have to see, and I can't even find the time to catch up on them. So for television, it's had a huge effect, and the fact that you can stream these shows, you can watch them in sequence, you can binge on them, everything else has been a real game changer. And even that idea of these shows that we see where they'll even be out for a year or two, and they're just kind of building up episodes and kind of getting by in the market, and then suddenly they hit some sort of tipping point. Everybody sees them, everybody catches up on the first few years, and suddenly you have this giant audience going forward. So it's a great time to be in the TV business. The movie business, for me personally, I think is a lot tougher right now. First of all, it's got to compete with this incredible TV. So how many times are you sitting at home where there's a movie opening and you go, well, maybe we should go see that movie. And then you go, yeah, but the latest 3 episodes of that show we love just came out, so let's just stay home and watch that instead. So getting people off that couch to go into the movie theater is really tough. And that's another thing that's factoring into this sort of preponderance of huge movies that are based on very strong IP that everybody's familiar with. It's either based on a giant novel, or it's Star Wars or Pixar or Marvel or the DC comic universe. The reason why that's become such a huge focus is that it's really hard to get people up and out to the theater unless they're seeing something that they just can't duplicate at home. I mean, even with a great sound system, at home, you're never going to duplicate that feeling of sitting in an audience of 1,000 people and watching something amazing happen on the screen. But it's making it really tough on those little movies or medium-sized movies that just can't get the traction. So a lot of those films end up just going straight to the streaming market. The fact is, the streaming market is still not, for films, not that financially sound. It's pretty tough to make a movie and get your money back in ancillary markets. It's really tough. You almost have to make money in theatrical to make that work. And again, getting that theatrical release right now is really tough.
And COVID, I'm assuming, has helped change these behaviors as well. Am I right?
Absolutely. Well, it's really, really accelerated those behaviors. I mean, you essentially had people shut out of theaters for quite a while, worldwide. So, I mean, movie going is a habit. And if you get out of the habit and you get into the habit of staying at home and watching that movie on, or watching your TV series, or, by the way, seeing that movie the same day it's coming out in the theaters or within a week or two of the time it comes out in the theaters, you're starting to change your habits. And so coming out of COVID, the mission is, how are people going to get back into that habit? Will they get back into that habit? Personally, I think some will and a lot won't. You can still make a movie that can be incredibly successful theatrically, but I just think it's gotten quite a bit tougher.
That's sad to hear, but thanks for sharing that. All right, Bill, we have to take a break. We've been doing a deep dive into your amazing film career, but coming up in the second part of my conversation with Bill Fay, the former CEO of Legendary Pictures, Bill shares how his current venture is going to disrupt the spirits industry.
The grand slam home run for us is if this became like any other built-in component of your liquor distilling and processing, and we certainly improve nearly everything we've tried it on and feel like that our market is absolutely everywhere.
To connect with David, go to davidradlow.com. David's book set, The Principles of Cartel Disruption and Secret Stories of Leadership, Growth, and Innovation, are available wherever books are sold. This has been Sustainable Leadership and Disruptive Growth with David Radlow, a presentation of Forbes Books.